communication. And actually, I think I'm going to start with soft speaking and then probably switch to whispering like later in the video. Okay. Politicians and their constituents can talk, but money as speech speaks much louder. Aspects of our present political system amount to a legal pay-to-play system in which the wealthiest can leverage indirect influence over elections, manipulating issues by buying lots of advertising, and more direct influence over legislation, manipulating politicians who desperately want money to pay for campaign advertising. There is plenty of evidence that the majority of Americans dislike this system. For example, a national poll in 2014 found that 75% of Americans think wealthy Americans have a better chance than others of influencing the election process. Another 71% responded that campaign contributions by individuals should be limited, and 76% said spending on ads by unaffiliated groups should be limited. This influence has been defended on First Amendment grounds. Here's what the First Amendment says about money as speech in political campaigns. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. In other words, it says nothing explicitly about money. Yet money now counts as speech, protected by the First Amendment. So, how did we end up here? Ironically, it started with Congress's intention to control the amount of money in elections. In 1974, emerging from the Watergate scandal, President Nixon's illegal tactics in the 1972 election, Congress amended federal election law to further limit campaign contributions. 2 years later, in Buckley versus Vallejo, in 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court suggested for the first time that political contributions count as speech. The court argued that restrictions on campaign money necessarily reduced the quantity of expression by restricting the number of issues discussed. The depth of the exploration, the size of the audience reached. This is because virtually every means of communicating ideas in today's mass society requires the expenditure of money. Over the ensuing years, Congress has tried to again rein in campaign finance with new laws, but federal courts, beholden to the idea that money equals speech, have always struck them down. This brings us to the current state of our national elections. The two main political parties and their supporters spent an estimated $6 billion on campaign advertising for the 2012 election, more than doubling the previous record. The main reason for the new record was the unlimited amount that corporations and rich individuals could now spend, thanks to another decision by the Supreme Court, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 2010. The 5-4 decision said that it was a violation of the First Amendment free speech rights for the federal government to limit corporate or union spending on TV and radio advertising, usually done through organized super PACs or political action committees, which are most often sponsored by corporate interests or super rich donors. While the Supreme Court decision ran counter to public opinion, many advocates on the political right and some on the left offered that the First Amendment means what it says. Congress shall make no law. Traditional First Amendment supporters like Gene Policinski of the First Amendment Center argue that the good intentions behind the idea of limiting campaign spending don't justify ignoring a basic concept that the Supreme Court majority pointed out in its ruling. Nothing in the First Amendment provides for more or less free speech protection depending on who is speaking. An advantage in advertising spending is only one of many variables. Obama still won re-election in 2012 despite more national party, super PAC, and campaign spending. Nevertheless, those with limited means are at a clear disadvantage compared to those who have money when it comes to buying expensive commercial speech and shaping the direction of a presidential campaign. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig argues that money corrupted American politics long before the Citizens United ruling. Politicians are dependent upon the funders, spending anywhere from 30% to 70% of their time raising money from these funders, he wrote. But the funders are not the people. 0.2% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% give the max to any congressional candidate, and 0.01% give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. That's 196 Americans. Given the Citizens United ruling, what can be done to give all citizens a voice in the campaign finance system and make them patrons of the political process? The cultural and political struggles over what constitutes free speech or free expression have defined American democracy. In 1989, when Supreme Court Justice William Brennan Jr. was asked to comment on his favorite part of the Constitution, he replied, "The First Amendment, I expect. Its enforcement gives us this society. The other provisions of the Constitution really only embellish it. Of all the issues that involve mass media and popular culture, none is more central or explosive than freedom of expression. The First Amendment. Our nation's historical development can often be traced to how much or how little we tolerated speech during particular periods. The current era is as volatile as time as ever for free speech issues. Contemporary free speech debates include copyright issues, hate speech codes on college and university campuses, explicit lyrics in music, violent images in film and television, the stopping of media files on the internet, and the right of the press to publish government secrets. In this chapter, we will examine free expression issues, focusing on the implications of the First Amendment for a variety of mass media. The implications. Investigate the models of expression, the oranges of free expression, the First Amendment. Examine the prohibition of censorship and how the First Amendment has been challenged and limited throughout U.S. history. Focus on the impact of gag orders, shield laws, and the use of cameras in the courtroom, and some of the clashes between the First Amendment and the Sixth Amendment. Review the social and political pressures that gave rise to early censorship boards in the current film rating system. Discuss First Amendment issues in broadcasting, considering why broadcasting has been treated differently from print media. Explore the newest frontier in free expression, the internet. One of the most important laws relating to the media is the First Amendment. While you've surely, wait a second. Okay. Well, you've surely heard about its protections. Do you see how and why it was put in place? Have you ever known someone who had to fight to express an idea? For example, was anyone in your high school ever sent home for wearing a certain t-shirt or hat that the school officials deemed offensive? Have you ever felt that your access to some media content was restricted or censored? What were the circumstances and how did you respond? The origins of free expression and a free press. When students from other cultures attend school in the United States, many are astounded by the number of books, news articles, editorials, cartoons, films, TV shows, and websites that make fun of U.S. presidents, the military, and the police. Many countries' governments throughout history have jailed or even killed their citizens for such speech violations. For instance, between 1992 and September 2014, more than 1,000 international journalists were killed in the line of duty, often because someone disagreed with what they wrote or reported. In the United States, however, we have generally taken for granted our right to criticize. And poke fun at the government and other authority figures. Moreover, many of us are unaware of the ideas that underpin our freedoms and don't realize the extent to which those freedoms surpass those in most other countries. In fact, a 2014 survey related that 66 nations allow virtually no freedom of the press, with those governments exercising tight control over the news media and even intimidating, jailing, and executing journalists. Only 1 in 7 people on the planet live in a country with a free media system. Models of expression. Since the mid-1950s, 4 conventional models for speech and journalism have been used to categorize the widely differing ideas underlying free expression. These models include the authoritarian, communist, social responsibility, and libertarian concepts. They are distinguished by the levels of freedom permitted and by the attitudes of the ruling and political classes toward the freedoms granted to the average citizen. Today, given the diversity among nations, the experimentation of journalists, and the collapse of many communist press systems, these categories are no longer as relevant. Nevertheless, they offer a good point of departure for discussing the press and democracy. The authoritarian model developed at about the time the printing press first arrived in 16th century England. Its advocates held that the general public, largely illiterate in those days, needed guidance from an elite, educating ruling class. Government criticism and public dissent were not tolerated, especially if such speech undermined the common good, an ideal that elites and rulers defined and controlled. Censorship was also frequent, and the government issued printing licenses primarily to publishers who were sympathetic to government and ruling class agendas. Today, many authoritarian systems operate in developing countries throughout Asia, Latin America, and Africa, where journalism often joins with government and business to foster economic growth, minimize political dissent, and promote social stability. And promote social stability because state leaders believe that too much speech freedom will undermine the delicate stability of their nation's social infrastructures. In these societies, criticizing government programs may be viewed as an obstacle to keeping the peace, and both reporters and the citizens may be punished if they question leaders in the status quo too fiercely. In the authoritarian model, the news is controlled by private enterprise. But under the communist or state model, the press is controlled by the government, because state leaders believe the press should serve the goals of the state. Although some government criticism is tolerated under this model, ideas that challenge the basic premises of state authority are not. Although state media systems were in decline throughout the 1990s, there are still a few countries using this model, including Burma, China, Cuba, and North Korea. The social responsibility model characterizes the ideas of mainstream journalism in the United States. The concepts and assumptions behind this model are outlined in 1947 by the Hutchins Commission, which was formed to examine the increasing influence of the press. The Commission's report called for the development of press watchdog groups because the mass media had grown too powerful and needed to become more socially responsible. Key recommendations encouraged comprehensive news reports that put issues and events in context, more news forms for the exchange of ideas, better coverage of society's range of economic classes and social groups, and stronger overviews of our nation's social values, ideas, and goals. A socially responsible press is usually privately owned, although the government technically operates the broadcast media in most European democracies. In this model, the press functions as a fourth estate, that is, as an unofficial branch of government that monitors the legislative, judicial, and executive branches for abuses of power. In theory, private ownership keeps the news media independent of government. Thus, they are better able to watch over the system on behalf of the citizens. Under this model, the press supplies information to citizens so that they can make informed decisions regarding political and social issues. The flip side of the state and authoritarian models, and a more radical extension of the social responsibility model, is the libertarian model, which encourages vigorous government criticism and supports the highest degree of individual and press freedoms. Under the libertarian model, no restrictions would be placed on the mass media or on individual speech. Libertarians tolerate the expression of everything from publishing pornography to advocating anarchy. In North America and Europe, many alternative newspapers and magazines operate on such a model, placing a great deal of trust in citizens' ability to distinguish the truth from fabrication. Libertarians maintain that speaking out with absolute freedom is the best way to fight injustice and arrive at the truth. The First Amendment of the Constitution. To understand the development of free expression in the United States, we must first understand how the idea for a free press came about. In various European countries throughout the 17th century, in order to monitor and publish and punish, if necessary, the speech of editors and writers, governments controlled the circulations of ideas to the press by requiring printers to obtain licenses from them. However, in 1644, English poet John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, published his essay Areopagitica, which opposed government licenses for printers and defended a free press. Milton argued that all sorts of ideas, even false ones, should be allowed to circulate freely in a democratic society, because eventually the truth would emerge. In 1695, England stopped licensing newspapers, and most of Europe followed. In democracies today, publishing a newspaper, magazine, or newsletter remains one of the few public or service enterprises that requires no license. Less than 100 years later, the writers of the U.S. Constitution were ambivalent about the freedom of the press. In fact, the Constitution, as originally ratified in 1788, didn't include a guarantee of freedom of the press. Constitutional framer Alexander Hamilton thought it impractical to attempt to define liberty of the press, and believed that whatever declarations might be added to the Constitution, its secretary would ultimately depend on public opinion. At that time, though, 9 of the original 13 states had charters defending the freedom of the press, and the states pushed to have federal guarantees of free speech and press approved at the first session of the new Congress. The Bill of Rights, which contained the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was adopted in 1791. The commitment to freedom of the press, however, was not resolved. In 1798, the Federalist Party, which controlled the presidency and Congress, passed the Sedition Act to silence opposition to an anticipated war against France. Led by President John Adams, the Federalists believed that defamatory articles by the opposition Democratic Republican Party might stir up discontent against the government and undermine its authority. Over the next 3 years, 25 individuals were arrested and 10 were convicted under the act, which also used to prosecute anti-federalist newspapers. After failing to curb opposition, the Sedition Act expired in 1801 during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson, a Democratic Republican who had challenged the act's constitutionality, pardoned all defendants convicted under it. Ironically, the Sedition Act, the first major attempt to constrain the First Amendment, became the defining act in solidifying American support behind the notion of a free press. As journalist and historian Michael Schudson explained, only in the wake of the Sedition Act did Americans boldly embrace a free press as a necessary bulwark of a liberal civil order. Censorship is prior restraint. In the United States, the First Amendment has theoretically prohibited censorship. Over time, Supreme Court decisions have defined censorship as prior restraint. This means that courts and governments cannot block any publication or speech before it actually occurs. On the principle that a law has not been broken until an illegal act has been committed. In 1931, for example, the Supreme Court determined in Near v. Minnesota that the Minneapolis newspaper could not be stopped from publishing scandalous and